There was a woman in my grandmother's neighborhood. Everyone knew her, not because she was loud or powerful or particularly remarkable in any way the world tends to reward, but because of one thing that nobody could quite explain. She didn't age. Not in the way people say that about someone who looks good for their age. I mean, she genuinely, visibly, undeniably did not seem to move through time the way everyone around her did. And people noticed. They always noticed. Nobody could tell you why. They'd say things like, good genes. They always say good genes when they don't have an answer. But here's what I want you to stay for. Because by the time we reach the end of this, you are going to know specifically, scientifically, historically, exactly why she looked the way she did. And it has nothing to do with her genes, nothing to do with her skincare routine, and everything to do with how she lived. To understand what those women had, you first have to actually see their lives. Not the romanticized version, not the Pinterest version with the perfect kitchen and the string of pearls. The real version. In the 1950s, particularly Black women lived inside a rhythm that we have almost completely lost the ability to imagine today. The day had a shape. It started at roughly the same time. It moved through roughly the same sequence of events, and it actually ended. There was a point in the evening where the day was done, where the mind was permitted to stop running. Think about the last time you had a day that actually ended. Their social lives were built on physical presence. You sat with people, you talked slowly, you had conversations that went nowhere in particular and lasted hours. That wasn't inefficiency. That was something the body deeply needed and was quietly receiving. They moved their bodies in functional, unstrained ways, walking to places, hands in soil, standing in kitchens with the windows open, not performing exercise, just living inside their bodies in a way that kept everything working. And here is the thing I want you to hold on to, because we'll come back to it. These women were not trying to age well. They were not on a wellness journey. They had no collagen supplements, no hormone panels, no biohacking routines. They were simply living in a particular way. And that particular way was doing something to their biology that we are only now, decades later, beginning to measure and understand. We'll get to exactly what that was. But first, let's talk about what stress actually does. Not in the motivational poster sense. Not in sayings like, stress is bad, practice self-care. But in the literal, cellular, biological sense of what chronic stress does to a woman's body over time. When your body perceives a threat, any threat at all, whether real or imagined, physical or emotional, it releases cortisol. That's the stress hormone, and in small doses, in short bursts, it is completely fine, it's functional, it's what kept our ancestors alive. But here is what nobody tells you. The female body is significantly more sensitive to cortisol than the male body. Research has shown that women experience stronger cortisol responses to psychological stress. This means that emotional pressure, social conflict, uncertainty, the feeling of never being finished makes the body take longer to return to baseline. What does prolonged cortisol exposure actually do? It accelerates cellular aging. Specifically, it shortens telomeres, the protective caps on your DNA, at a measurably faster rate. Shorter telomeres mean faster aging, not just on the surface. In every system in the body, it drives chronic inflammation. And inflammation, the research is now overwhelmingly clear, is the engine underneath almost every visible sign of aging. The skin, the joints, the eyes, the energy, all of it. It disrupts sleep architecture. and disrupted sleep, particularly in women over 35, triggers a cascade of hormonal shifts that accelerate the very things we spend hundreds of dollars trying to reverse. Now, here is where it gets interesting. The women who aged best, and I mean this historically, across cultures, across decades of observation, were not women who had easier lives. Many of them had extraordinarily hard lives. But they had something that kept their cortisol lower than it should have been, given their circumstances. And it wasn't meditation. It wasn't therapy. It wasn't anything we would recognize today as a wellness practice. We'll get to it. But first, let's take a dive into what they were actually doing. Before we learn what they were actually doing, it's best to subscribe if you haven't done so already, because number 4 will make you surprised. When researchers began seriously studying longevity and aging in women, not just lifespan, but the quality and appearance of aging, certain patterns kept appearing. Patterns that crossed income levels, crossed geography, crossed era. 4 of them show up consistently. And when you hear them, you will recognize them because you've seen them in your grandmother's life or your great aunts or the older women in your community who seem to carry time differently. The first one is rest as a non-negotiable, not sleep. Specifically though, sleep matters enormously, but rest in the broader sense, the cultural permission to stop. Mid-century women, particularly in close-knit communities, had a relationship with rest that was structurally built into their days. Afternoons that slowed down, evenings that were genuinely quiet, a Sunday that meant something different from every other day. The nervous system was given time to complete its cycles. Modern research on the autonomic nervous system tells us exactly why that mattered. The second is the depth of their social bonds, not the number of their connections, the depth. These women had small, tight, consistent circles of people they saw physically, regularly, and unhurriedly. Research from the Harvard Study of Adult Development, one of the longest-running studies on human well-being ever conducted, found that the quality of close relationships was the single strongest predictor of how well people aged. Not diet, not exercise, relationships. Those women were living that finding 70 years before the study concluded it. The third is what I'd call limited decision fatigue. This one is going to sound almost too simple. But the cognitive load of modern life, the infinite choices, the constant optimization, the pressure to be continuously deciding and improving and pivoting, is a form of chronic stress that did not exist at that scale for most women in the mid-20th century. Their days were more prescribed. And while we might call that limiting, the nervous system experienced it as something else entirely. It experienced it as safety. And the fourth one. This is the one that will make you angry because it is so ordinary. So completely embarrassingly ordinary. And yet it is one of the most well-supported findings in the longevity literature. They moved slowly on purpose. Not lazily, not passively, but they did not rush. The pace at which they moved through their days physically, conversationally, socially was measurably slower than what we now consider normal. And pace, it turns out, is a direct signal to the nervous system about whether it is safe or under threat. A woman who moves slowly through a room is telling her own body, we are not in danger, we are not being chased, we have time. And her body believed her. Now let's bring the science directly to what we just talked about. Because this is not intuition. This is not nostalgia dressed up as wisdom. This is documented, peer-reviewed, and in some cases, remarkably recent. Start with the Blue Zones research. Dan Buettner's decades of fieldwork identifying the world's longest-lived populations found that the communities where women aged best shared almost none of our modern wellness vocabulary. They weren't intermittent fasting, they weren't tracking their steps. Now, this is not to say that all of these are bad or do not work. I'm simply trying to point out something through this research. They were actually doing something much harder to package and sell. They belonged somewhere. They were needed by people they saw every day. Their lives had a natural rhythm they had not disrupted in decades. Does this sound familiar? I'm sure it does. Then there's the telomere research. Dr. Alyssa Eppel at the University of California has spent years studying the relationship between psychological stress and cellular aging in women. Her findings are striking. Women who reported higher levels of perceived stress, not just measurable life events, but the feeling of being overwhelmed, behind, insufficient, had telomeres equivalent to women 10 years older than their chronological age. 10 years. Not from illness, not from poverty. It's from the feeling of not being enough and never being done. Listen to that again slowly. And then there is the inflammation research. Chronic low-grade inflammation, the kind triggered not by infection, but by sustained psychological stress, social isolation, and disrupted sleep, is now understood to be the primary driver of visible aging in women. Not sun damage, not genetics. Inflammation. And the lifestyle that 1950s women lived, the rest, the community, the unhurried pace, was an almost perfect anti-inflammatory protocol. Not by design, by accident of culture. And here is the one that the data makes unmistakable. The finding that nobody connects to aging but should. Social touch. Physical, casual, non-romantic social touch, like a hand on the arm, sitting close to someone, being embraced without occasion, triggers the release of oxytocin, which directly suppresses cortisol. Women in tightly bonded mid-century communities were being touched in the most ordinary, social, unremarkable ways constantly. At church, in kitchens, on porches, in beauty shops. Their cortisol was being regulated by their social environment without any of them having a word for what was happening. We lost that, and we aged faster because of it. So when did it change? Because something did change, gradually, then all at once, and the way those things tend to happen. And if you are a woman between 40 and 60, you lived through at least the tail end of it. You may not have had words for what was shifting, but your body registered it. The 1980s reframed everything. Busyness became a virtue, not just acceptable, but admirable. The woman who was always doing something, always producing, always available, always optimizing, she became the aspirational figure. Rest became laziness, slowness became failure. Unhurriedness became something you had to earn somewhere in the future after you had done enough. Except enough never came. It never does. The structure that had regulated women's nervous systems for generations, the prescribed rhythms, the physical community, the cultural permission to stop was replaced piece by piece with something that looked like freedom but functioned like chronic stress. The freedom to work longer, to be reachable always, to carry the mental load of every decision, every relationship, every ambition simultaneously, and the body kept the score. Inflammation levels in women began rising. Sleep quality deteriorated. The age at which women began reporting feeling exhausted, not tired, but exhausted, crept steadily younger. And the visible signs of accelerated aging that the research now connects directly to chronic stress became so common that we stopped recognizing them as unusual. We started calling it just getting older. But it wasn't just getting older, It was a specific, traceable cultural shift, one that removed the very conditions under which women's bodies had been quietly protected for generations and replaced them with conditions that the female nervous system was never designed to sustain. And there is one piece of this that the data makes particularly clear. One shift that nobody talks about in the context of aging, but that the research connects directly to accelerated cellular decline in women. The collapse of unstructured, purposeless time that had no output, no product, no optimization value, time that existed simply because the day had slowed down and there was nowhere to be and nothing to produce. That kind of time, which would have been completely ordinary to a woman in 1955, is now so rare that most women cannot remember the last time they experienced it. And the nervous system, deprived of it, never fully recovers between cycles of stress. It stays elevated, slightly, chronically, invisibly, and it ages the body from the inside out in ways no serum can touch. So what do we do with this? I want to be careful here, because the worst thing I could do is turn everything we've just walked through into a list like 5 tips for aging like a 1950s woman. That would miss the point entirely, because this is not about tips. It's about a reframe. The women who aged well were not trying to age well. They were not optimizing for it. They were not tracking it. They were living inside a set of conditions, rhythm, rest, unhurriedness that protected their biology as a byproduct, not as a goal. Which means the question is not, what should I add to my routine? The question is, what have I been convinced to live without that my body actually needs? Rest that is not earned, that is not scheduled between 2 other obligations. That simply exists because you are a person, and persons need to stop. Are you living with any of that? Slowness that is not laziness. The physical pace of moving through your own life without the low-grade urgency that modern culture treats as normal. When did you last walk somewhere without checking your phone? When did you last sit with someone for 2 hours and not produce anything from it? I'm talking about the physical community. Not followers, not connections. People whose hands you have held, whose kitchens you have sat in, whose presence regulates your nervous system simply because they are there and they know you. The women who didn't age had all of this. Not because they were wiser, not because they were more disciplined, but because the culture they lived in had not yet taught them that these things were optional. In this present times, we have been taught they are optional, but the research says otherwise. Remember the woman I told you about at the beginning? The one in my grandmother's neighborhood. The one who didn't seem to move through time the way everyone else did. I understand her now in a way I didn't then. She wasn't lucky. She wasn't genetically exceptional. She was living inside these conditions quietly, without naming them, without knowing they were protecting her, that the rest of the world was slowly dismantling around her. She rested without guilt. She moved without urgency. She belonged to people who belonged to her. She had days that ended. That was her secret, and it wasn't really a secret at all. It was just a way of living that we were gradually persuaded to believe we were too busy for. The science has now confirmed what she already knew in her body, what your grandmother probably knew, what you may have glimpsed in your own life in the moments when everything slowed down and you felt unexpectedly like yourself again. The question now is not whether you know it. The question is, what are you willing to reclaim? And what are you finally willing to put down? Let me know your answers in the comment section below. Before I go, I have a reminder for you. As a woman who operates in her femininity, remember to be kinder to yourself. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. I'll see you in the next video.